All right, let's start the next talk, which is the final talk of the session by Scott Kominers.
Is the clicker working?
I don't know. Yep.
Okay.
On chain stability and trading networks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here wrapping up what has been a session of fantastic talks, all of which will be better than this one. But, you know, it's the closer. So I will be presenting chain stability and trading networks. This is joint work with John Hatfield, Alex Nichifor, Mike Ostrovsky, and Alex Westkamp. And I should say it's a very auspicious day for the talk because it happens to be Alex Westkamp's birthday. This paper is in some sense has a paper that has bearing on a deep existential question that we face sort of throughout game theory writ large, and in particular in matching theory. You know, you might wonder, you know, is the market in equilibrium? And if you were in equilibrium, you know, how would you even know? How would we go out and figure out whether this works? Should add it's a doubly auspicious day for this talk because it's also the birthday of one of the greatest and sort of founding existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre. I'll be mispronouncing his name throughout the talk. But he, in fact, had a view on this problem, which is that equilibrium is characterized by an existence that precedes its essence. What does that mean? I admit it requires a little bit of interpretation, but you might interpret that as saying that we are likely to have more confidence in the solution concepts that sort of are out there as easier for us to verify, but even more we're willing to believe in solution concepts where the agents themselves might be able to sort of run small perturbations to see whether they are in fact in equilibrium. All right, so we will return to the existentialism throughout the talk, but let me quickly tell you a bit about what the talk will contain beyond that. So we're going to be thinking about a trading network framework, which is roughly the same as the one that Ravi just very kindly set up for us in his preceding talk. We'll imagine that agents can be both buyers and sellers. Prices can be discrete or continuous. We won't necessarily need quasi-linear utilities. And we'll also, although I will not deal with this in detail in the talk, be thinking about indifferences and preferences, exactly because of these prices. Stability, again, sort of thank you again for the fantastic setup, because this will all sort of fit into the framework that you've already seen. Stability is going to be a condition where there's no deviations by sets of agents. And chain stability, which is going to be slightly different from trail stability, we're going to say is no deviation by chains of agents. And what's a chain? Well, this is going to be sort of a natural generalization of pairwise stability. So it might be these sorts of strings where F sells to G sells to H. I would say also a minor contribution to this paper is in sort of trying to figure out what the right pairwise stability analog in a trading network market is. And it turns out that you need chains that sort of can go in cycles. Footnote, this makes it a triply auspicious day because it is also the birthday of the Ferris wheel. I mean, that one's really quite surreal or existential. And we might, in fact, need to go a little bit further, which is to allow sort of self-crossing chains. And so, we have sort of the more modern roller coaster model of pairwise stability. What's the advantage and a little bit of a hint of what this is going to tell us about understanding equilibria? Chain stability is going to be asymptotically easier to check than stability. And in lots of different contexts, it'll be even much easier than that. And we're going to show that essentially, if agents' preferences are fully substitutable and satisfy these sort of monotonicity regularity conditions called the laws of aggregate supply and demand, then in fact, stability is going to exactly coincide with chain stability. Note I have this line here jointly in scare quotes. That's going to be dealing with indifferences. We're going to need sort of these two conditions to hold truly sort of at the same time in a way that I'll clarify a little bit in a few minutes. Moreover, and here again we have echoes of the preceding paper, we're going to see when utility is fully transferable, so quasi-linearity, it turns out that full substitutability implies the laws of aggregate supply and demand, and in fact this joint condition, and so we'll again get a linkage then through the stability competitive equilibrium linkage that shows that chain stability and consistency with competitive equilibrium coincide. Okay, so that's where we're going. Any questions from there? Cool. All right. So basic framework, again, 90% of you were here for the previous talk, so this is going to look exceedingly familiar. We have a finite set of agents, and agents engage in bilateral trades. A trade, again, can express the exchange of a good or service. And every trade has a seller and a buyer. This is an orientation for coordinatization. We'll form contracts off of trades by taking trades and associating each one of them with a price, some real number. And so a contract is going to be a pair that specifies a trade and a price for that trade. And then agents will have choice correspondences derived from utility maximization. So they'll have sort of in the background utility functions over sets of trades, and in fact, sort of potentially nonlinear utilities over prices. And so you might have frictions of the type in Ravi's paper. You might be in a quasi-linear world. For the purposes of today, we're just going to be working with the induced choice correspondence. And of course, this is very natural in light of Sartre, because we are our choices, as he taught us. Good. So there are two sort of main regularity conditions, both of which are classic now, or versions of classic conditions in generalized matching. One of them is full substitutability, which is a generalization of gross substitutability. It means sort of two things at once. So it means that if you receive new buy contract options, then you're weakly less interested in available purchase contracts. So if I give you new options for places, suppliers of your inputs, you become weakly less interested in the suppliers you had before. And then you become weakly more interested in possibilities for selling your outputs. So you're weakly more interested in possible sale opportunities, and vice versa for new sale options. So if you get some new downstream purchaser, that means you might buy more inputs, and you're weakly less interested in your old purchasers. A quick way to keep track of what this means, you can think of it as being a conjunction of same-side substitutability. So contracts on the same side substitute for each other in exactly the classic substitutability sense, and cross-side complementarity. If I get new contracts on the other side of the market, then I have more interest in contracts. Or on a side of the market, I have more interest in contracts than the other side of the market. So that's substitutability. Second condition, laws of aggregate supply and demand. These are monotonicity conditions. So this says, when the set of available buy options expands, the net demand, say the difference between the number of buy and sell side contracts you choose, weakly increases. And again, likewise for sell side contracts. What does this mean? It's sort of, there's no mega input. There's no single input that can replace two. And again, sort of this is definitely without loss, not without loss of generality. There's sort of real meaning to this condition. And if you label your contracts in weird ways that sort of bundle, some contracts are twice as many bales of hay as other contracts, then you could see how this would break down. But for natural ways of coordinatizing, especially a trading network or a buyer-seller market, we think of this as making sense. Those are two classical conditions. They showed up in different forms in Kelso and Crawford and Hatfield and Milgram, and now sort of in the trading network models. For our work, we're actually going to need something that's very slightly stronger than saying that both of these conditions hold at the same time, which is that in the presence of indifferences, you can have these conditions sort of hold simultaneously, but across different branches of the indifferences. So it might be that you behave in a way that is substitutable when responding and sort of on one part of your indifference set, and satisfies the laws of aggregate supply and demand on the other part of your indifference set. And this sort of sequence breaking means that strange things happen. So we impose this condition called monotone substitutability, which is sort of like a unifying conjunction of the two conditions. And it says exactly that you don't have this sort of sequence break. Again, it's hard to think of a world where you would have these two conditions and you wouldn't also have this one. But there is a little bit of subtlety there. Lastly, sort of last piece of the setup is our solution concepts. So stability, putting a little bit more notation on the version we just saw. So stability is two components. First is individual rationality. So that means that each agent is choosing his or her assigned contracts. So choice from A contains the set of contracts assigned. Here again, using this in sign because of indifferences. This is a correspondence, not necessarily just a set. And unblockedness is I can't get together a set of agents and a set of contracts such that all of those agents, who are deviating, so everyone involved in the deviation, wants to choose their deviated contracts. or deviation contracts. This should feel very familiar. This is a natural generalization from the world of Gale and Shapley up into the world of trading networks. As hinted earlier and in the title, we also have this chain object. So a set of contracts is going to be a chain if all of its elements can be arranged in some sequence such that the seller of the next item in the chain is the buyer of the previous one. So in particular, it can cross itself, right? So footnote, remember, this propagation rule happens here. So seller of L plus 1 is buyer of L. It could also happen here, seller, buyer, and so forth. All of these are going to be permitted under this definition. All we need is that there's a sequence, a consistent sequence that defines the agents in the chain. Incidentally, it is stunningly difficult to find a photo of a roller coaster not moving in a loop. As you'd probably expect from these two definitions, chain stability is going to be exactly, sorry, this would have been blue, but apparently it's not today, is going to be exactly stability with chain merged in here. So we're going to require that the blocking sets be chains. Yes?
You might have explained this earlier, but how does CI vary as a function of other agent strategies?
So here we're not asking anything about agent strategies. So your type is just your choice set, and we're working with the choice functions in existence. So, but in particular, we have no externalities. I guess no non-pecuniary externalities, if you will. All right. So that's the framework. Any questions with the setup? Yeah?
So maybe I missed it. Was there some continuity assumption?
No continuity assumption.
But there are transfers.
There are transfers, but we can't have discrete transfers. They don't have to be continuous.
Are they discrete?
They could be. They could be discrete, could be continuous. We don't use any feature of discrete or continuity in transfers.
But you would need some continuity for existence of this.
Yes, we'll come back to that. So this is, the theorem is going to hold even in contexts where we don't know existence results. So main result, if agents' preferences are monotone substitutable, then stability is going to be equivalent to chain stability. We prove this by way of a key lemma, which actually also has an analog in sort of very, very classic marriage problem era matching theoretic results, which is that under this monotone substitutability condition, for any blocking set, if that set is not a chain, then I can sort of decompose it into chains. I can keep boiling off chains until I get down to sort of a final set. So every time I can peel off a chain such that A is still blocked by Z having removed that chain. And if I iterate this repeatedly, so if I apply this lemma over and over again, I've got to get to a point where Z is a chain. And that proves the theorem. So the art is going, peel off chain and chain, decompose into blocking sets. As I just said, the art is going to be improving this lemma. Everyone happy? Cool. All right, so as I risk doing a proof at this time of the afternoon, we're actually going to find that it's really intuitive. You can basically start anywhere. And this also has an analog in classical matching theory. You start in the middle by sort of pulling an arbitrary contract Z0 that's somewhere in the blocking set. And we're going to build a chain around it. So that buyer, if we say we're going to take that out of the blocking set, the associated buyer might want to drop some contracts. Sorry, that should be a superscript, not a subscript. By full or same-side substitutability, we know something about what those contracts look like. So when you lose access to a particular purchase contract, you're going to be weakly more interested in all of the purchase contracts you had before, right? That same-side substitutability. This was substituting for something. Now, I took it away. You're much more interested in the, you're not going to throw away some other buy contract, but you might drop some sell contracts. And the law of aggregate supply tells us that we're going to drop at most one of those. Right? This input was sort of turning into at most one output. So if we call that new contract Z1, we could repeat this argument and sort of keep pushing down the chain until at some point there's no new sell-side contract to drop. And that's going to be sort of a terminus on one direction. And then we can reverse the argument and work upstream. And so in a blocking set, there's actually like a lot of chaininess inside of an arbitrary blocking set. You can sort of drop in, pick up a contract, and it's like self-assembly. You can sort of grow the chain on the other side, or on each side. although not with the, quite the refinement of trail stability. So this gets us our main equivalence. Now coming to Christoph's question, this is a general result. In particular, it covers the previous talk setting, and it also covers settings where existence isn't guaranteed. So this is going to be true of the outcomes when they exist, but might also be true in contexts where they don't. Luckily, again, Sartre has told us that existence is an imperfection, so we're safe there. It's in some sense a feature, we think of it, that we can prove the result for any such equilibria that we can find, irrespective of whether there's a sharp existence result, although there is some imperfection there, we admit. As I mentioned, it's a little bit sharper in the quasi-linear case. There, all you need is full substitutability, and you get also consistency with competitive equilibrium. But lastly, as promised, this will have something to say about our existential question from before. And that is because chain stability is in many ways much, much easier to check than stability. So first of all, we prove in this paper a density theorem, that essentially the density of the set of chains, this is relative to all possible blocking sets, is going to get very, very small as the number of trades gets large. Not nearly large enough for this margin to contain, but there's a really cool probabilistic proof for this, which the argument for which was come up with by one of our students, Joseph Shayani. Happy to talk about it offline. Moreover, you can say much stronger things if you have more structure. So for example, in the Ostrovsky supply chain framework, so here it's a vertical supply chain. You sell downstream, you purchase upstream. The total number of chains is going to be polynomial in sort of the structure of the supply chain, but the number of total blocking sets is going to be exponential. In the Sun and Yang exchange economy, you actually get a constant bound. I put a constant bound in this slide because that feels like the right thing to say at a computer science conference. The bound is actually 2. So the all chains have 2 elements. Number of sets still exponential. And then lastly, the second speaker of the session in joint work with I have no idea how to pronounce your co-author's name. I'm sorry, and Vora. So Ipatropou and Vora, maybe. Yeah. Excellent. In joint work showed that under the quasi-linear cases, you can actually find chain blocks in polynomial time using a flow argument. So lots of different ways that we think people could actually find these chain blocks. They're both testable from an empirical perspective, and we think that people working around in the market might actually be able to detect them. So what's the story for the day? If all agents are jointly fully substitutable and monotone substitutable, if you will, stability is going to be equivalent to chain stability. And chain stability is easier to check than stability. And this we find heartening because we can't look out in the world. We often empirically look out in the world and say, let's assume the market is stable in the matching theoretic sense, and then we're going to do estimation. But checking that condition is actually really hard. Checking chain stability is at least sort of in some formal sense easier. So that's our first sort of existential view. But also, for the participants, we think chain blocks in the same way that we believe pairwise blocks might be easier to find, in the same way we believe trailwise blocks, or however you want to call them, might be easier to find. We think chain stable outcomes are ones we could believe would exist, that people might find chain blocks and sort of boil out those deviations. Apologies for the abuse of the term boil here. It means slightly different things the 2 times I used it. So, so finally, what is the message of this paper? It's that full substitutability plus law of aggregate supply and demand implies equivalence between stability and chain stability. Chain stability easier to check than stability, but in fact, Sartre gave us a version of this, which is little flashes of sun on the surface of a cold, dark sea, where the little flashes of sun here were clearly the chains, and the cold, dark sea is this great, deep expanse of all blocking sets. And so that's the main theorem of the paper. QED.
Questions?
I have an existential question.
Yes.
Which is, this is a self-criticism of matching literature, and I feel I can do that as I'm part of it. Any application of this that you want to take this to data, the fundamentals of the market are changing over time, and checking whether the market is in a stable equilibrium is just a very weird empirical exercise. I never understood that.
No, it's true. So So the question is, none of these markets are actually static. And so when we do empirical estimation, assuming that the market is static, whether we're assuming stability or anything else, it's sort of an odd baseline assumption. That's right. So what you would really want is some way of making a statement about the steady state. What a lot of the people who do empirical I/O based on matching methods are essentially assuming is that there is the market has reached a steady state equilibrium, and that is stable. So what we're pushing on here is, how simple a requirement for the market can that be? And we're arguing it can be a simpler requirement than you might think. People have to find all arbitrary blocking sets. But following, if you're identifying off an immediate shock or something, thinking that it was immediately stable before, right after, even if it was before, certainly hard. And I don't think we have a good answer for that. Somebody in this room should solve that problem and present it next year.
Existence may be imperfection, but let's thank the existence of all the speakers for this session.